Imagine finding out that the life you built with your own two hands doesn't belong to you anymore, and that everyone around you, your wife, your closest friends, your own family, has known about it for 2 years and said absolutely nothing while you kept showing up to work, kept believing you mattered, kept trusting the people who were laughing behind your back. That is exactly what happened to a man named Desmond, and by the time you finish this story you are going to feel something in your chest that makes you want to check your own bank statements twice. 15 years ago, Desmond and his best friend Julian sat in a cramped apartment with 2 laptops, a whiteboard covered in half-erased ideas, and a dream that most people would have laughed at. They were building a logistics software company from nothing, the kind of idea that either dies quietly in a drawer or turns into something worth hundreds of millions, and theirs turned into the second kind. Desmond was the quiet one, the architect behind the scenes, the one who wrote the algorithms that made the whole system actually work, while Julian was the face, the charisma, the one who walked into rooms and closed deals. They agreed early on, back when they had nothing to lose, that Desmond would take a 50% silent stake. He would build the technical backbone and stay largely out of the public spotlight while Julian ran daily operations, made the hires, sat across from investors, and became the name people associated with the company. Felt fair. Felt like trust. Desmond believed, with the kind of certainty that only comes from real friendship, that this arrangement was permanent, that his equity was untouchable, that no matter how big the company grew, he owned half of what they built together. He watched from a distance as the company scaled from a 2-man operation into a business with hundreds of employees, offices in 3 cities, and a valuation that made financial news. He didn't need the spotlight. He had Julian's word, a stack of old paperwork, and 15 years of history that felt unbreakable. His wife, Priya, had been there from the very beginning too, back when they were eating instant noodles in that same cramped apartment while Desmond coded through the night. She knew every version of this dream, every setback, every late night Desmond spent debugging systems that Julian would later present to investors as his own vision. Desmond trusted her completely, the way you trust someone who watched you build something from absolutely nothing. He trusted Julian too, because you don't build a company with someone for 15 years without believing that bond means something. But trust, as you're about to see, can be the most expensive thing a person ever gives away. 2 years ago, something shifted, though Desmond had no idea it was happening. There were board meetings he wasn't invited to, restructuring conversations that happened behind closed doors, legal paperwork that moved through channels he never saw. Desmond had stepped back from the daily grind by then, focusing on a few technical projects and trusting the company's growth to run on the foundation he'd already built. He still considered himself a 50% owner. He still introduced himself at family gatherings as a co-founder. He still believed every single day that his name was written into the ownership structure of the company he had given 15 years of his life to. What he didn't know was that somewhere in a lawyer's office, on a piece of paper he never signed and never saw, his name had already been quietly erased. Drop a comment right now and tell me what you would do if you found out the people closest to you had been keeping a secret like this from you for years, because I want to know if you'd have seen it coming or if you'd have been completely blindsided like Desmond was. The morning of the company's annual all-hands meeting started like any other. Desmond dressed in his usual understated way, grabbed coffee, and drove to the office he rarely visited anymore, mostly because Priya had gently encouraged him to show his face this year, to reconnect with the team, to be present for once instead of buried in his home office writing code nobody outside the engineering department ever saw. The auditorium was packed. Julian was on stage, animated as always, walking investors and employees through a slide deck celebrating the company's best year yet. Desmond sat near the back, proud in the quiet way founders are proud, watching a business he'd helped create hit milestones he once only dreamed about. Then came the moment that would unravel everything. During the networking session after the presentation, a new hire in the finance department, someone who had no idea who Desmond was, struck up a casual conversation near the coffee station. She mentioned, almost in passing, how impressed she'd been reviewing the company's cap table during onboarding, how clean the ownership structure looked after what she called the buyout 2 years ago. Desmond smiled politely and asked her to clarify, assuming she meant some minor operational restructuring he simply hadn't been looped in on. She elaborated without hesitation, completely unaware of the bomb she was detonating, explaining that the sole founder listed with any equity stake was Julian, that there had been a buyout of a former co-founder's shares finalized 2 years prior, and that the paperwork had been remarkably smooth. That night, Desmond didn't say a word to Priya about what he'd learned. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his old filing cabinet, the one with the original incorporation documents, the founding agreements, everything from those early days in the cramped apartment, and he started reading through every page like his life depended on it, because in many ways it did. What he found sent a cold wave through his entire body. Buried in a folder of documents he vaguely remembered signing during what he'd been told was a routine restructuring 2 years earlier was a share transfer agreement. His signature at the bottom, transferring his entire 50% stake to a holding company controlled by Julian for a fraction of what it was actually worth. Desmond stared at the signature. It looked like his. It moved like his. But he had absolutely no memory of ever agreeing to sign away half of everything he'd built. He remembered signing paperwork around that time. Yes, but Julian had framed it as tax optimization, as protecting the company's structure ahead of a potential acquisition offer, as something routine that the lawyers recommend everyone sign to keep things clean. Desmond had trusted him. He hadn't read every line. Why would he? This was his best friend of 15 years. The next morning, Desmond confronted Priya first, not Julian, because something in his gut told him she already knew, and he needed to hear it from her before he lost his mind entirely. He was right, and it broke something in him that no amount of time would ever fully repair. Priya admitted, through tears, that Julian had approached her nearly 2 years ago, explaining that Desmond's continued involvement was creating liability concerns for a major acquisition deal that was in the works, that the buyout was in everyone's best interest, that Desmond would still receive money, just not the ownership stake, and that it would be easier if she helped guide him towards signing the paperwork without making him suspicious or upset. She told Desmond she believed she was protecting their family's financial security, that Julian had painted her into a corner with talk of lawsuits and complications if Desmond resisted, and that she regretted every single day of silence that followed but felt trapped once the lie had already been told. Desmond sat in his own kitchen, the kitchen his software had quite literally paid for, and realized that the person who was supposed to be his partner in life had chosen someone else's version of the truth over him. Not once but every single day for 2 years, watching him walk around believing he still owned half of everything, saying nothing while he made plans, celebrated milestones, and trusted a fabricated reality. He then went to Julian, and the confrontation was nothing like the explosive cinematic showdown you might expect. Julian didn't deny it. He didn't even seem particularly ashamed. He explained with the same calm confidence he used to close 9-figure deals, that the buyout had been necessary, that Desmond's disengagement from daily operations made his continued 50% stake structurally inefficient for future funding rounds, and that he genuinely believed Desmond would be happier with a lump sum and less complexity in his life. Desmond asked him one simple question. "Why didn't you just ask me?" Julian's answer was the part that broke him more than anything else. Julian said he knew Desmond would say no, and he wasn't willing to risk the company's future on a friendship that, in his words, had already served its purpose. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because I think it says everything about how some people view loyalty once it's no longer convenient for them, and this is where I have to be honest with you as someone who's narrated hundreds of these stories. The betrayals that hurt the most are never the loud ones, they're the quiet, calculated ones dressed up as protection, where someone convinces themselves they're doing you a favor by taking something that was never theirs to take. In the weeks that followed, Desmond hired a lawyer, and what he uncovered was even more disturbing than the initial betrayal. The signature on that transfer document, while technically his, had been obtained during a period when Julian had deliberately overwhelmed him with a stack of nearly 40 pages of paperwork related to an unrelated tax filing, burying the critical page deep enough that Desmond had signed it without reading closely, exactly as Julian had planned. His lawyer explained that while this bordered on fraud, proving intentional deception in court would be an uphill, expensive and lengthy battle, especially with Priya's testimony potentially complicating things given her involvement. Desmond had to make a decision that no one should ever have. The lawsuit dragged on for 11 months, and during that time Desmond learned things about the company he helped build that made the original betrayal feel almost small by comparison. His legal team subpoenaed internal communications, and buried in thousands of emails was a thread from nearly 3 years earlier, months before the so-called buyout even happened, where Julian had reached out to a corporate attorney asking in plain language how he could streamline ownership ahead of an acquisition offer he hadn't yet disclosed to Desmond. This wasn't a decision made in a moment of financial panic or structural necessity. This was premeditated, planned months in advance, with Julian quietly laying the groundwork while continuing to sit across from Desmond at dinners, at holidays, at the 10th anniversary party they'd thrown for the company where Julian had stood up and given a toast calling Desmond the brain behind everything we've built, the partner who never needed the spotlight to know his worth. Desmond had cried actual tears of gratitude that night. He read that email exchange in his lawyer's office and felt something in him go numb in a way that grief usually does when it stops feeling like sadness and starts feeling like disbelief. The acquisition offer Julian had been protecting turned out to be real and massive. A deal that would have valued the company at nearly $400 million had it gone through as planned. It fell apart for unrelated reasons 18 months later, but the intent was undeniable. Julian had positioned himself to walk away with the entire windfall alone, cutting Desmond out before the money ever became real, banking on Desmond being too trusting, too disengaged from day-to-day operations, and too loyal to ever suspect a thing. The court proceedings revealed something else too, something that reshaped how Desmond understood his entire marriage. Priya hadn't just passively gone along with Julian's plan out of fear, as she'd claimed in their kitchen that terrible morning. Financial records showed she'd received a series of consulting payments from Julian's holding company over an 18-month period, funds that started flowing almost exactly when the buyout planning began. When Desmond's lawyer presented this in a deposition, Priya's explanation shifted, softened into something closer to complicity dressed up as coercion. She maintained she'd been afraid of what would happen to their household finances if she resisted Julian, but the paper trail told a story of someone who had, at some point, stopped being a reluctant participant and become an active one, quietly compensated for her silence while her husband believed she was simply protecting the family. I have to say something here, and I know some of you are going to disagree with me, but watching this unfold, I don't think this was ever really about the money for Julian, not entirely. I think this was about a very specific kind of person who cannot stand feeling indebted to someone else's brilliance forever. Someone who spent 15 years being introduced as the founder while quietly resenting that half the credit, half the ownership, half the story belonged to a man who barely wanted the spotlight in the first place. Sometimes betrayal isn't about greed alone. Sometimes it's about a wound to someone's ego that they never told anyone about, festering for over a decade until they finally had the means to fix it, no matter who it destroyed in the process. Drop your theory in the comments about what you think was really driving Julian here, because I don't think this was purely financial, and I want to hear if you agree with me or think I'm giving him too much credit for having a reason at all. The trial itself became something of a spectacle within their industry, quietly covered by a few business publications that specialized in startup drama. Though Julian's PR team worked hard to keep the story from gaining wider traction. Desmond sat through weeks of testimony, watching Julian's lawyers argue that Desmond had willingly signed the transfer agreement, that ignorance of what he signed didn't constitute fraud, that a sophisticated businessman with 15 years of experience should have read every page of every document placed in front of him. There was a brutal truth buried in that argument that Desmond couldn't fully escape, even as he fought it. He had trusted too completely, verified too little, and let comfort with an old friendship replace the diligence he would have applied to a stranger. This is a lesson that echoed through every part of the trial, and it's one worth sitting with regardless of how this story ends, because trust without verification isn't really trust at all. It's just hope wearing a disguise, and hope is not a legal document. After 11 months, the case settled out of court rather than going to a full verdict, largely because Julian's legal team recognized that the premeditation revealed in those early emails created significant risk for them at trial. Desmond didn't get his 50% stake reinstated. The company's structure was too far removed from that possibility by then, but he received a settlement substantial enough to be considered a full and fair valuation of what his original ownership would have been worth, along with a public acknowledgement, buried in legal language, that the original transfer had not met the standard of fully informed consent. It wasn't the triumphant courtroom victory people sometimes imagine when they hear stories like this. There was no dramatic gavel moment, no tearful public apology from Julian. It was quiet, procedural, and in many ways deeply unsatisfying because money, even a life-changing amount of it, could never repay what Desmond actually lost, which wasn't ownership in a company but 15 years of belief in a friendship he now understood had an expiration date he simply hadn't been told about. Desmond and Priya finalized their divorce around the same time the settlement closed. She kept trying for months to reach some kind of understanding with him, insisting that whatever she'd done, she still loved him, that the payments were about fear more than betrayal, that she wanted to rebuild what they had. Desmond listened to all of it, and in the end he told her something that I think about a lot when I consider this whole story, that he didn't hate her and he wasn't sure he ever fully would, but he could no longer trust his own judgment of her. And a marriage without trust in your own perception of the person beside you isn't really a marriage anymore, it's just cohabitation with extra steps. Julian, for his part, kept the company. He kept the acquaintances, the industry reputation, the version of the story where he was simply a savvy businessman who made a difficult decision for the good of the company. Desmond heard, through a mutual contact almost a year later, that Julian had told people the falling out was due to creative differences and Desmond's disengagement from the business, a version of events so sanitized it barely resembled what had actually happened. That's the part of this story that sits heaviest with me, honestly, the fact that people can rewrite 15 years of someone else's life and hand out that rewritten version at dinner parties, and most people will simply nod along because they have no reason to question it. So here's what I think really happened underneath all of this, and I want you to tell me if you see it differently. I don't think Julian ever set out, back in that cramped apartment 15 years ago, to betray his best friend. I think somewhere along the way, as the company grew and the world started treating Julian like the sole genius behind it all, he started believing his own myth. And once you believe you're the only reason something exists, sharing credit starts to feel like theft rather than fairness. I think Priya got caught in the middle of that ego, offered a way out that felt safer than confrontation, and slowly talked herself into believing silence was protection rather than betrayal. And I think Desmond's real mistake wasn't trusting his friend 15 years ago when they built this together. It was never updating that trust as the stakes got higher, never once asking the uncomfortable question of what happens to loyalty when hundreds of millions of dollars enter the picture. Loyalty tested by hardship is real. Loyalty tested by extreme wealth is a completely different animal. And this story is proof that the people you trust with your life aren't always the people you can trust with your equity. If you made it this far, I want to know what you would have done in Desmond's position, whether you'd have fought for years like he did or walked away the moment you found out, and whether you think Priya deserved a second chance or not, because I read every single one of your comments and I genuinely want to know where you land on this one. If this story kept you hooked, do me a favor and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if Desmond deserved better, and leave a comment telling me which part of this shocked you the most, because that's what keeps this channel growing and keeps these stories coming. I'll see you in the next one.